Hello everyone, I am once again coming back with another video featuring the i7-4790K plus the RX 6600 combination PC. The 2014 era LGA 1150 motherboards were really the last generation to support the DDR3 RAM sticks, and going forward Intel and AMD both switched to using DDR4 RAM on their future platforms. In my previous videos covering this PC, I had specified using 24GB of 1600MHz DDR3 RAM in a mismatched configuration. The RAM sticks in question are two pairs of Kingston RAM. One is a generic 8GB stick rated to run at 1600MHz with cast latency, CL for short, of 11 at 1.5 volts. The other stick is a 4GB stick rated to run at 1600 MHz with a CL9 at 1.65 volts and comes with an XMP profile for easy configuration. When using all four sticks together, the system defaults to using the slowest speeds that the mismatched sticks are rated for, and it is generally advised by system builders to use the same brands, speeds and CL when populating all four RAM slots to avoid any system stability problems. With all the settings at defaults, this PC was running all 24GB configuration at 1600 MHz with CL11, but researching this topic online, I have read that it is quite easy to squeeze tighter timings out of the generic DDR3 RAM and push their clock speeds up to 1800 MHz without applying excessive amounts of voltage. I have decided to test both pairs of RAM on their own in dual channel configuration at their rated speeds and cast latency. And after that, I tried to squeeze tighter timings and higher clock speeds from each stick pair. And finally, I combined all the sticks and gradually squeezed tighter timings and higher clocks until the system started crashing with blue screen errors. The best configuration I was able to achieve manually with the 24GB configuration was running all sticks at 1800 MHz with CL10. When testing the two-stick configuration, I refer to the holy motherboard scriptures and follow the instructions to first populate channel B of this particular motherboard to appease the machine spirit within. For benchmarking purposes, I am running Windows 11 IoT LTSC 24H2. The Spectrum Meltdown patches were not disabled for testing in this video because I only realized that halfway through testing and I couldn't afford to waste any extra time redoing the tests again. The CPU and GPU are all running at their stock vanilla settings with no overclocks. The benchmarks of choice are Counter-Strike 2 on the lowest settings at 720p, offline bot deathmatch in Dust 2, 3D Mark Firestrike CPU tests, Space Marine 2 on the lowest settings at 720p, playing the first combat encounter in Mission 1, Quake Remaster on the lowest settings at 720p, playing through E1M1, and finally Doom Eternal on the lowest settings at 720p, playing the first combat encounter in the Super Gore Nest level. Starting with the Counter-Strike 2 results, the 2x4GB sticks running at their rated XMP profile of 1600 MHz with CL9 returned a respectable frame rate average of 121 with 1% lows of 70 and 0.1% lows of 52. Overclocking these sticks up to 1800 MHz with CL9, we see that the average frame rate jumps to 135, the 1% lows to 76 and 0.1% lows to 58. Switching to the 2x8GB RAM pair running at their rated speeds of 1600 MHz with CL11, the average frame rate is 119 with 1% lows of 80 and 0.1% lows of 61. Squeezing the timings of this RAM pair to CL9 at 1600 MHz shows that the frame rate drops to an average of 114, 1% lows to 68 and 0.1% lows to 51. It should be noted that this bizarre performance drop on the 2x8GB sticks with tighter timings only occurred with Counter-Strike 2. I was also unable to push the stick pair to 1800 MHz at CL9 without getting blue screen errors. Switching to the 24GB RAM configuration running at the default 1600 MHz speeds with CL11, we get an average frame rate of 106, 1% lows of 64 and 0.1% lows of 55. Using tighter CL9 timings at 1600 MHz, the average performance increases to 128 FPS, 1% lows to 74 and 0.1% lows to 57. Finally, applying the 1800 MHz overclock with CL10, the average frame rate increased further to 133, 1% lows to 77 and 0.1% lows to 64. Before jumping to the next benchmark, I would like to humbly request that you subscribe to the channel and like if you enjoyed watching this video or have watched any of my previous videos. YouTube is already running ads on my videos, but I am unable to monetize the videos unless I reach 1000 subs and a certain watch time in a 90-day period, so any support coming from you is extremely appreciated. Up next is the 3D Mark Firestrike CPU results. The 2x4GB at 1600 MHz with CL9 scores 4220 points and goes up to 4458 points when overclocked to 1800 MHz with CL9. The 2x8GB pair at 1600 MHz with CL11 manages to score 4243 points, and with tighter CL9 timings at 1600 MHz manages to score 4389 points. Switching to the 24GB configuration at 1600 MHz with CL11, we get a score of 4300 points, and with CL9 timings at 1600 MHz, the score increases to 4439. And finally, overclocking to 1800 MHz with CL10 timings, we get the best score overall in this benchmark with 4483 points. The next game benchmark is Space Marine 2, which I recently picked up on a Steam sale. The game is a really enjoyable horde shooter with both melee and range combat focus, and it allows for co-op play in all of its game modes. I highly recommend checking it out. Our system, while under the recommended CPU specs, is still able to launch and play the game. With 2x4GB 1600 MHz CL9 configuration, the average frame rate is 37 with 1% lows of 3 and 0.1% lows of 1. This makes the game technically playable with some irritating stutters. Overclocking the 2x4GB RAM to 1800 MHz CL9, the average frame rate increases to 45, the 1% lows to 31, and 0.1% lows to 25, which drastically improves playability as the stutters are less noticeable. Switching to the 2x8GB RAM at 1600 MHz CL11, the average frame rate is 42 with 1% lows of 27 and 0.1% lows of 3. With timings lowered to CL9 at 1600 MHz, the average frame rate and 1% lows stay at their respective 42 and 27, but the 0.1% lows increase to 12. Switching to the 24GB setup at 1600 MHz with CL11, the frame rates are very similar to the 2x8GB CL9 results with an average of 42, 1% lows of 27, and 0.1% lows of 11. Reducing the timings to CL9 at 1600 MHz, the performance increases to an average of 43, 1% lows to 28, and 0.1% lows to 24. And finally, with an overclock of 1800 MHz and CL10 timings, the performance average increases to 48, 1% lows to 32, and 0.1% lows to 26, giving us the best overall results here. Quake Remaster benchmark results are next, and the 2x4GB sticks at 1600 MHz CL9, the frame rate averages are around 869 with 1% lows of 540 and 0.1% lows of 321. Overclocking the RAM to 1800 MHz at CL9 increases the averages to 962, the 1% lows to 627, and the 0.1% lows to 335. The 2x8GB setup running at 1600 MHz with CL11, the frame rate averages at 859 with 1% lows of 524 and 0.1% lows of 346. With the timings lowered to CL9, the average increases to 879, the 1% lows to 590, and the 0.1% lows to 423. Switching to the 24GB configuration, running at the default 1600 MHz with CL11, the average frame rate is around 874 with 1% lows of 586 and 0.1% lows of 403. Reducing the timings to CL9, the average increases to 944, the 1% lows to 633, and the 0.1% lows to 467. Finally, with an overclock of 1800 MHz and CL10 timings, the average frame rate is 984 with 1% lows of 679 and 0.1% lows of 519. Our final benchmark is Doom Eternal. With the 2x4GB configuration at its default 1600 MHz CL9, the average frame rate is 159 with 1% lows of 109 and 0.1% lows of 3, indicating some nasty stuttering every now and then. Overclocking the RAM to 1800 MHz, the average climbs to 173 with 1% lows of 118 and 0.1% lows of 23, meaning we still have some stutters but not as nasty as before. Switching to the 2x8GB sticks at 1600 MHz CL11, we get an average frame rate of 172 with 1% lows of 119 and 0.1% lows of 33. Very similar results to the overclocked 2x4GB setup. With the timing squeezed to CL9, the average frame rate is 176 with 1% lows of 124 and vastly improved 0.1% lows of 101. Mixing all 4 sticks of RAM together at the default 1600 MHz CL11 timing, the average frame rate is 177 with 1% lows of 125 and 0.1% lows of 99, similar to the previous results. With tighter CL9 timings, the results are relatively similar, with an average of 179, 1% lows of 128, and 0.1% lows of 98. Finally, overclocking to 1800 MHz with CL10 timings, the performance increases to an average of 192, with 1% lows of 131 and 0.1% lows of 108, again achieving the best overall results. When testing for this video, I was curious if a mismatched RAM configuration had any effect on performance compared to the 2x8GB configuration, and it turns out in most cases the mismatched RAM configuration was pretty much on par with the base 2x8GB configuration, except in Counter-Strike 2. Although performance in Counter-Strike 2 can sometimes be unexplainable and could be up to black magic or something else. Overclocking and tightening the timings on the 24GB configuration also yielded a net performance boost across the board, with increases to average 1% lows and 0.1% lows in all titles, and we managed to achieve the best overall performance scores. There also was an extra surprise result with the 2x4GB configuration. I initially expected the 8GB total memory to produce the worst results overall, but the overclocked 2x8GB RAM with CL9 timings produced some rather impressive averages, but fell a little bit short with regards to 1% lows and 0.1% lows. I wouldn't be surprised if matching 4 sticks of this particular RAM at 16GB running 1800 MHz with CL9 produced even better results compared to the mismatched 24GB configuration running overclocked 1800 MHz at CL10. My guess is that there is still some performance that could be squeezed out of this system by overclocking the CPU and pairing it with overclocked RAM with decent timings, but that is for another video, as I spent way too much time testing these memory configurations. I hope you all enjoyed this video and found it somewhat informative. Please leave a like and comment on the video if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Please take care of yourselves and goodbye.